Well, thank you, everyone. It's really a bit overwhelming to be introduced thus. Thank you, Arthur, especially for the cheesecake, but for everything else as well. Somehow, even before I had told him, he had figured out, he read my mind, that cheesecake was my favorite dessert. And he went for that. I also want to thank the people who made this possible, from cheesecake to arranging everything here, and the crew which is filming this. Thanks to you all, and the students and my colleagues who are here, and my colleagues who are away but sent me nice notes saying that because they were not here, they couldn't actually come. So I know they are here in spirit, and we are going to talk about spirituality, so that may be apt. I also want to thank those who came from the ILIF school, and especially Professor Tinker and Loring and David, my colleagues from the economics department, and some people from the community as well. I have to tell you, having thanked everybody, that I feel more apprehensive about giving a talk like this than any other talk I've ever given in my life. And I have done a lot of public speaking. And the reason is that these are things about which I have felt my way through my whole life. So I do have actually, believe it or not, very strong convictions about these things. On the other hand, I realize how difficult it is to put those things into words. Even if you do have invisible means of support, it is still very, very difficult, I think. And sometimes it also flies in the face of the received wisdom of academe, where we are supposed to keep things very compartmentalized and very separate. Perhaps my virtue, if it is a virtue at all, has been that I have never followed this dictum. I have never tried to keep things separate and compartmentalize them. I know it has been troublesome for some people to figure me out. It has been troublesome for me sometime also. But that's the way I pretty much live my life, including my intellectual life, which I don't really separate from other parts of my life. I'm also afraid because of another thing. When I was trying to list things, somebody told me that I should make a list of things. I'm not very good at making lists, but when I actually ended up making a list and revising it, I still am left with about 9 things. And time is limited, so let me first give you the list. And then I will talk about some of them more than others. You can think of it not as a ladder, step by step, but more like a spiral staircase that I will try to lead you through. But it might also turn out to be a maze. So I will start by making some basic distinctions between terms, religion, spirituality, fetishism, reification, from several different disciplinary points of view, starting with anthropology and finishing with ideological critiques that are based on political economy, or I should say critiques of political economy. Then I will spend some time talking about values in political economy. That was the term actually used before we got so fascinated by price by classical political economists, as well as values in what I would call an ontologically grounded ethics. And then I will mention a few things about what I call modern capitalist violence as opposed to strictly religion-motivated difference, religiously motivated violence. And the distinction is not really easy to make. That would be really the main point. And then I will spend some time, maybe most of my time on this, Islam's encounter with this modernity, which has a lot to do with capitalism and its highest stage, which is imperialism, and the failure, frankly, of the modernizers in Islamic countries to resist this imperialism, which has caused a lot of problems that sometimes are looked at in very different and, in my view, superficial ways. There are both internal and external reasons for this, and they're both important. We heard from our speaker last week that religion really is a modern construction as people discuss it today. And I will agree with that with a few qualifications that will help us. And the qualifications I will make in terms of what are called analytical social psychology aspects, starting with Freud's friend, who was a pastor actually, Pfister, Oscar Pfister, Erich Fromm, Erikson, people like Fowler, Faber, and especially Heinz Kohut and his self-psychology. Meissner, who is both a Jesuit and a psychoanalyst, Rizzuto and Sudhir Kakar, who is a very interesting thinker from India, also a psychoanalyst, among other things. And I will also get to history at some point, maybe throughout the talk, but a kind of history that is multi-causal, that is nuanced, historiography, and especially from the subaltern point of view, that needs and does include oral history from ordinary people and story of their lives. And the majority of the people in the world are ordinary people. And that's really an amazing thing that we talk about history, but we never really talk about their history, or very rarely do we talk about their history. And then I will try to reach a kind of synthesis from the point of view of practical reason. And here I will, throughout actually, I will be using a kind of historically based hermeneutics. Gadamer is probably the most famous thinker who used this and introduced a very big German term, which is too scary to really talk about. But what it really means when you translate it is an effectively historicized view of consciousness, both individual and social. And that will, I hope, bring us to the end and final distinction, which is that between a political modern version of religiosity and what Kakar actually has called practically engaged political spirituality. And his prime example for that is Gandhi. But also we have the example of Martin Luther King, who was quite directly influenced by Gandhi. And I will make an appeal for a tolerant form of democracy that can deepen both liberal insights about democracy as well as some of the more radical insights and practices about democracy. And I will take very seriously what people like Charles Taylor ask us to do, that we live in a world of diversity, but we do not always acknowledge the diversity. And so we do need to develop ethical and political knowledge and practices, most importantly, that will allow to fairly and consistently manage the moral, spiritual, and cultural diversity in our world. And that, I think, is the practical agenda that we really have to address at the end. So I've pretty much given you my whole talk. Now, to begin at the beginning, what is the difference between religion and spirituality? I actually brought a little book by Kakar, who I think makes a very good point in making this distinction. Roughly, spirituality is really a generalized version of religion without some of the negative aspects of religion. But let me allow Cocker to speak for himself. This is from a little book that is, I think, really wonderful to read. It's called Mad and Divine, Spirit and Psyche in the Modern World. He tells us that religion and spirituality are not synonyms, even if they are often regarded as such by many who have been brought up in the Judeo-Christian worldview. The theological belief in God may be of great help in the striving for spiritual progress, but it is not a necessity. In many Hindu, Buddhist, and Taoist schools, an experiential understanding of the true nature of the self is sought through an intensive practice of certain meditative, contemplative disciplines, which do not require the presence of religious belief. In some early forms of Upanishadic and yogic mysticism, for example, there is no trace of love or yearning for communion with God, which is considered the highest manifestation of spiritual mood in the Christian and Islamic mystical traditions, as also in the Hindu bhakti, devotionalism, without which no spiritual illumination is conceivable. Zen Buddhist practice, too, is silent on the question of a divine being. In many Eastern traditions, then, spiritual progress is achieved entirely through the seeker's own efforts and without the intervention of divine grace. Spiritual disciplines regard themselves as scientific in the sense that they describe the stages and processes of transformation of consciousness through specific practices. And indeed, as we shall see later, they are descriptions of mental states reached through spiritual meditative practices are no longer solely dependent on the subjective but credible reports through the ages of advanced practitioners, but have begun to gather tentative support from recent brain research in the emerging discipline of neurotheology, which seems to have identified the state of consciousness in advanced meditation through its traces in the brain, the quieting of parietal lobes and the lighting up of the frontal lobe during the intense concentration of meditation when all sensory inputs are blocked. Actually, I found the book written by two such people, one of whom I don't think is alive anymore, sadly, who are researchers in this field, very, very illuminating. And I will not talk about neurotheology during this talk. What I have is already enough. But I will cite some people that they cite about mysticism. I was really very pleased to find that two basically neurobiologists and cognitive scientists have been able to gather all these, many of my most favorite mystics, both from among the regular mystics and also among some of the 20th century scientists. So let me just quote from some of these mystics so that you get some idea about spirituality without my having to explain it in very laborious prose. First, Black Elk, the Oglala mystic and shaman, he says very plainly and very deeply, I think, the following, that peace comes within the souls of men when they realize their oneness with the universe. And Meister Eckhart, who is one of my favorite mystics, says it in prose, but he also says it very beautifully. How then am I to love the Godhead? Thou shalt not love him as he is, not as a God, not as a spirit, not as a person, not as an image, but as sheer, pure one. And into this one, we are to sink from nothing to nothing. So help us, God. And a Taoist, Lao Tzu, who actually is acknowledged to be the founder of Taoism by some, he says, ordinary men hate solitude, but the master makes use of it. embracing his aloneness, realizing he is one with the whole universe. Actually, that reminds me of a French pop song, or maybe it's a chanson, really, by Georges Moustaki. And the line that I really love is, Je ne suis jamais seul avec ma solitude, that I'm never alone with my solitude. But the Islamic mystics, as Kakor correctly says, express this message of love and the longing for oneness probably most intensely among all the mystics I'm familiar with. Hallaj, who actually lost his life for what he said, he actually exclaimed, Ana al-Haq, which meant literally that I am God, I am He, who is the creator. And since the rulers didn't like that kind of expression of mysticism very much, he paid for it with his life. But here is what he said. I am he whom I love, and he whom I love is I. We are two spirits dwelling in one body. If thou seest me, thou seest him. And if thou seest him, thou seest us both. And my favorite scientist has always been Einstein. I actually did study physics art. I've forgotten a lot, but I still remember enough and enough math to follow at least some of the papers in cosmology, which always has been my favorite corner in physics. But Einstein talked about a cosmic religious feeling. And he says, it is very difficult to explain this feeling to anyone who is entirely without it, especially as there is no anthropomorphic conception of God corresponding to it. The individual feels the nothingness of human desires and aims and the sublimity and marvelous order which reveal themselves both in nature and in the world of thought. He looks upon individual existence as a sort of prison and wants to experience the universe as a single significant whole. And Erwin Schrödinger, who actually was one of the deepest scientists, everybody who studies quantum mechanics has to study the Schrödinger wave equation. He says, inconceivable as it seems to ordinary reason, you and all other conscious beings as such are all in all. Hence, this life of yours you are living is not merely a piece of the entire existence, but is in a certain sense the whole. Thus, you can throw yourself flat on the ground, stretched out upon Mother Earth, with a certain conviction. You are one with her and she with you. You are as firmly established, as invulnerable as she. Indeed, 1,000 times firmer and more invulnerable. Well, with this, we are back actually to Hallaj. But the person among the Islamic mystics who has been my favorite since I was a child is someone named Rabia. She was from Basra, so sometimes she's called Rabia al-Basri. And this is, I think, a very good translation of one of her poems. She says, talking to God personally, you are my breath, my hope, my companion, my craving, my abundant wealth. Without you, my life, my love, I would never have wandered across these endless countries. I look everywhere for your love.